Let me be direct with you. What we witnessed yesterday, Secretary of State Marco Rubio standing before reporters and announcing that Operation Epic Fury is over, was not a victory statement. It was not a triumphant declaration from a superpower that achieved its objectives. It was something far more significant and far more troubling for Washington's long-term strategic position in the Middle East. What Rubio said, stripped of its diplomatic language, is this: America launched the largest concentrated military operation in modern history, dropped nearly 900 strikes in 12 hours, assassinated Iran's supreme leader, and yet Iran still controls the Strait of Hormuz. Iran's nuclear program still exists, and Iran has not signed a single piece of paper agreeing to anything. That is not victory. That is a strategic stalemate, and in geopolitical terms, a stalemate against a smaller regional power is itself a form of defeat for the world's self-proclaimed sole superpower. Now I want you to think carefully about what I am about to tell you, because Western media will not frame it this way. They will show you maps, they will show you footage of precision strikes, they will parade retired generals in front of cameras telling you that America achieved its military objectives. And technically, some of those objectives were achieved. Khamenei is dead. Iran's conventional military infrastructure has been significantly degraded. Several nuclear facilities were struck. But here's the question that no mainstream anchor is asking: what happens the morning after? What happens when the bombs stop falling and the cameras turn away? What remains on the ground? And the answer, as of today, the 6th of May 2026, is deeply uncomfortable for Washington. What remains is an Iran that is still standing, still defiant, still holding the world's most critical oil choke point hostage, and still refusing to come to the negotiating table on America's terms. Let us talk about Project Freedom, because this episode alone tells you everything you need to know about where this conflict actually stands. 2 days ago, the United States military launched what Trump called Project Freedom, an operation to escort commercial vessels safely through the Strait of Hormuz, bypassing Iran's blockade. It was presented as a show of American naval dominance. Aircraft carriers, destroyers, the full weight of the Fifth Fleet positioned to guarantee freedom of navigation. And within 48 hours, not 48 days, not 48 weeks, within 48 hours, Trump announced that Project Freedom was being paused. The official explanation was progress in diplomatic talks. But let us be honest about what actually happened. Iran made clear it would contest any American-escorted convoy. Exchanges of fire occurred in the Strait on Monday, and rather than escalate, Washington blinked. That is the geopolitical reality beneath the diplomatic language. A superpower that launches an operation and suspends it within 2 days has not demonstrated strength. It has demonstrated the limits of its appetite for further escalation, and this brings me to the deeper strategic question that I believe is at the heart of this entire conflict. What was America's actual end state? What was the defined objective that would constitute success? Because if the objective was to eliminate Khamenei, that was achieved on the 28th of February. If the objective was to degrade Iran's missile capabilities, that was partially achieved, though Iran still fired approximately 300 missiles in the first 12 hours alone and has since demonstrated continued capacity. If the objective was to force Iran to abandon its nuclear program and sign a new comprehensive agreement, that has not happened. Iran's foreign minister is in Beijing today, meeting with his Chinese counterpart. Iran is communicating with Washington through Pakistani intermediaries. Iran has not collapsed. Iran has not surrendered, and Iran's hardline leadership remains firmly in control of the decision-making apparatus in Tehran. Now I want to bring in a dimension that most analysts in the Western commentariat are deliberately ignoring, and that is the role of China and Russia in this entire situation. Gilbert Doctorow, and I say this as someone who has studied his analysis closely, has consistently argued that the failure of Putin and Xi to enforce their stated red lines has fundamentally undermined global deterrence. And we are seeing the consequences of that failure play out in real time. When America launched Operation Epic Fury on the 28th of February, Russia issued statements of concern. China called for restraint. Neither took any concrete action to defend a country that both had described as a strategic partner. Iran was left to fight essentially alone against the combined military might of the United States and Israel. And yet, and this is the remarkable part, Iran did not collapse. Iran absorbed the most concentrated air campaign in modern military history and is still negotiating from a position of leverage. Because it holds Hormuz, and Hormuz is worth more than 1,000 diplomatic statements from Moscow or Beijing. The fact that Iran's foreign minister flew to Beijing today for the first time since the war began is significant. It tells us that Tehran is actively working to rebuild its international support structure. China's economy is directly exposed to the Strait of Hormuz disruption. Somewhere between 20 and 25% of China's oil imports pass through that waterway. Beijing cannot afford indefinite closure of Hormuz. And Iran knows this. Iran is essentially telling Beijing, you stayed silent when we needed you in February, but now you need us to reopen this strait. That is leverage. That is geopolitical leverage of the highest order, and Tehran is using it with considerable skill. Think about what I just told you, because if you think this diplomatic chess game is complex now, what comes next completely changes the entire board. Trump is heading to China next week. The timing is not a coincidence. Beijing holds a unique card in this situation. It has economic influence over Tehran that Washington simply does not possess. And the question that will define the next phase of this conflict is whether Trump is willing to offer China something significant enough to convince Beijing to pressure Iran into a deal. That negotiation between Washington and Beijing, conducted in the shadow of a war that has already sent global oil prices up 50%, is the real story, not the strikes, not the missiles. The backroom conversation between the two great powers about who gets what in the post-war Middle East order. I have been watching American foreign policy for decades. I watched the hubris of Iraq. I watched the strategic miscalculation of Libya. I watched the 20-year failure in Afghanistan. And I will tell you plainly, the pattern I see emerging here is disturbingly familiar. A massive application of military force that achieves tactical objectives but fails to produce the desired political outcome. An adversary that refuses to behave according to Washington's script, and an administration that is now scrambling to define what success actually looks like, because the original definition, a denuclearized, compliant Iran, appears increasingly out of reach without either a negotiated compromise or a ground invasion that no one in Washington is seriously prepared to undertake. So let us now turn to the question that the title of this video poses directly, and I want you to stay with me here because the answer is more nuanced than either side wants to admit. Did Iran win? And is America simply buying time? Because these are not mutually exclusive possibilities. In fact, the most honest analytical assessment of where we stand today suggests that both things are simultaneously true, and that tension between those two realities is precisely what makes this moment so dangerous and so consequential for the entire global order. Let me start with the case for Iran winning. Not winning in the conventional military sense, Iran's armed forces have taken catastrophic losses. Its air defense network has been systematically dismantled. Its conventional military infrastructure has been severely degraded. Khamenei is dead. Dozens of senior IRGC commanders are dead. Iranian cities have absorbed strikes on a scale that no nation has experienced since the Second World War. By any traditional measure of military power, Iran has been badly damaged. But war is not decided purely by military metrics. War is decided by political outcomes. And the political outcome as of today is this: Iran still controls the Strait of Hormuz. The global economy is being held hostage by a country that just absorbed nearly 900 American strikes and is still standing at the negotiating table demanding respect, demanding sanctions relief, and demanding that Washington acknowledge Iranian sovereignty. That is not the behavior of a defeated nation. That is the behavior of a nation that understands that its greatest weapon was never its missiles. Its greatest weapon was always geography. The Strait of Hormuz is approximately 33 kilometers wide at its narrowest point. Through that narrow corridor passes roughly 20% of the world's oil supply. Every single day that Iran keeps that strait effectively closed, through the threat of force, through harassment of vessels, through the simple, credible promise of retaliation against any ship that passes without Iranian consent, every single day costs the global economy billions of dollars. American gasoline prices are already 50% higher than they were before the war began. Supply chains are fracturing. Shipping companies are rerouting around Africa, adding weeks to delivery times and enormous costs to global trade. The economic pressure is not falling on Iran alone. It is falling on Europe. It is falling on Asia. It is falling on the American consumer. And that is Iran's leverage. That is why Tehran has not collapsed. That is why Iran's negotiators are not coming to the table with hat in hand. They are coming with Hormuz in their back pocket, and everyone in that room knows it. Now, let me make the case for America buying time, because that interpretation is equally valid and perhaps even more important for understanding what comes next. Trump paused Project Freedom not because of diplomatic progress, despite what the official statements say. He paused it because exchanges of fire in the Strait on Monday demonstrated that any serious American attempt to force the waterway open would risk reigniting full-scale combat. And full-scale combat in the Strait of Hormuz, with Iran's remaining anti-ship missile capabilities, with mines, with IRGC fast boats, with the very real possibility of a struck oil tanker turning that narrow waterway into an environmental and economic catastrophe, that is a scenario that would send oil prices not 50% higher but 200% higher overnight. Trump understands this. His advisors understand this. And so the pause is not diplomacy. The pause is risk management. The pause is Washington acknowledging that the military instrument has reached the limit of its utility and that the next phase of this conflict will be decided not by bombs but by economic pressure, diplomatic maneuvering, and the willingness of third parties, particularly China, to play a constructive role. And here is where I want to bring in something that almost no Western analyst is discussing seriously, and that is the role of Pakistan in this entire situation. Iran's foreign ministry confirmed today that diplomatic messages are being exchanged with Washington through Pakistani intermediaries. Think about what that means geographically, strategically, and politically. Pakistan, a nuclear-armed state, a country with deep historical ties to both the Arab world and Iran, a country that shares a long border with Iran and has its own complex relationship with Washington. Pakistan is now the communication channel between the United States and the Islamic Republic. That is an extraordinary development. It tells us that direct communication between Washington and Tehran has either broken down completely or is politically impossible for both sides at this moment. And it tells us that the diplomatic resolution of this conflict, if one comes, will be shaped not just by American and Iranian preferences, but by the interests and influence of a much wider set of regional and global actors. I want you to think very carefully about the trajectory here, because what I'm about to tell you will not appear in your evening news broadcast. The ceasefire that was declared on the 8th of April has held, barely. Exchanges of fire continue in and around the Strait of Hormuz. Iranian proxies continue to strike American assets across the region. The IRGC has publicly stated it is fully prepared to resume large-scale operations, and Trump has now threatened, as of this morning, to resume bombing at a significantly higher level of intensity if no deal is reached. That is not the language of a conflict winding down. That is the language of a conflict in a dangerous pause, where both sides are recalculating, both sides are repositioning, and both sides are waiting to see who blinks first. The question is not whether this conflict is over. The question is what the next chapter looks like. And the answer to that question will be determined in the conversations happening right now. In Beijing between Iran's foreign minister and Wang Yi, in Islamabad between Pakistani mediators and American envoys, and next week in whatever room Trump and Chinese leadership occupy when they sit down together. Let me close with what I believe is the single most important strategic insight from everything we have discussed today. The United States entered this conflict with overwhelming military superiority and achieved significant tactical objectives, but it failed to achieve the decisive political outcome that would justify the enormous costs in treasure, in global credibility, in alliance relationships, and in economic disruption that this war has already imposed. Iran entered this conflict as the weaker military power but has leveraged its geographic position, its willingness to absorb punishment, and its control of a critical global choke point to survive, to remain standing, and to force the world's most powerful military into a pause. That is the fundamental strategic reality as of the 6th of May 2026. Not American victory, not Iranian defeat. A dangerous, unstable, unresolved confrontation between a superpower that cannot afford to lose and a regional power that refuses to surrender. The coming weeks will tell us whether diplomacy can produce what military force could not, whether Trump's trip to China opens a genuine pathway to de-escalation, whether Pakistan's mediation produces a framework that both Washington and Tehran can accept without either side losing face entirely. I am not optimistic. I have watched too many of these situations to believe that a clean resolution is imminent. But I am watching carefully, and I would urge you to watch carefully as well. Not the headlines, not the press conferences, not the triumphant statements from either side. Watch the strait. Watch whether ships start moving freely. Watch whether Iran's foreign minister returns from Beijing with something concrete. Watch whether Trump's tone changes after China. Those are the real indicators. Those are the signals that will tell us whether this war is truly winding down, or whether we are simply in the eye of the storm before something far larger arrives.